And welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, a recovering politician, and it's not a 12-step program, but it's a good program. And President and CEO here for the last 6 years. I recently moderated a panel at the Munich Security Conference, a very well-known international conference that's been going on for 40 years. And that panel was the first ever look at Congress's role in foreign policy, and members of that panel were Senators Lindsey Graham, Chris Murphy, and Jeanne Shaheen. And in the front row was Senator John McCain, who has gone to the Munich conference for 40 years and always brings a big congressional delegation with him. This year, he brought 16 members of Congress. That delegation attracted a lot of interest, and so did my panel, not because of me, but because, in case you missed it, there is some anxiety out in the world about the U.S. role in foreign policy going forward, and a whole bunch of people think that Congress really matters. I'm looking at two colleagues here. Congress really matters, and meaning that it matters that Congress pay attention and that hopefully Congress come up with good ideas on a bipartisan basis. So to show off how good Congress can be, we imported two people. Their names are Mark Warner and Dan Sullivan, a bipartisan duo who are strong supporters of the U.S.-India relationship. And they will talk about current thinking in Congress, especially focusing on defense. They are both members of the Senate India Caucus, which Mark Warner co-chairs. He is also vice chairman, senior Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee. You may have noticed that committee in the news lately, not so much about India, but about another country that starts with R. And there are enormous, there's a lot of interest in how extensively the Senate and House Intelligence Committees will investigate Russia's role in the 2016 U.S. election and alleged, I'm trying to be clear here, alleged relationships between members of the Trump administration and some senior Russian officials. Senator Dan Sullivan doesn't have to spend all of his time on intelligence issues, I don't think, but he is a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves. He was a staff officer to the commander of U.S. Central Command in 2004 and was deployed in the Middle East and Central Asia. They're not the only two guys who know a lot about India. So does the Wilson Center. We recently launched the India in Asia initiative, which examines India's growing engagement in the Asia-Pacific region and what this means for the United States. And thanks to the leadership of Michael Kugelman sitting in the front row, we write prolifically about this issue and talk extensively. Because of converging interests, think concern about China, fears about terrorism, and personal chemistry, a warm rapport between former President Obama and Indian Prime Minister Modi, our analysis of the relationship has reached a very broad audience. We have convened the right leaders, hosting talks by former Prime Minister Singh and former Finance Minister Mukherjee, and we've hosted multiple U.S. ambassadors to India and Indian ambassadors to the U.S. As I mentioned, with the new administration yet to articulate a formal policy on India, we hope that this event will be a good start in making certain that Congress is at the table and the approach to the U.S.-India relationship continues to be bipartisan. So, to moderate this conversation, Wilson Center Global Fellow Ray Vickery is here. He has more than 40 years of experience with India and the U.S.-India relationship, both in the public and private sectors, including a stint at the Commerce Department as Assistant Secretary for Trade and Development, and a leader at the U.S.-India Business Council. In 2011, he published a book on the strategic aspects of the U.S.-India economic engagement. Please welcome our panel, our friends, and please let me turn this conversation over to Ray Vickery.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Harmon. We really appreciate that. I want to add my welcome to you senators. I think that the role that the Congress will be playing is going to be more and more important as we move forward. I'm speaking close as I can now. All right, now we got it. I think that our format here today will be that we will have opening remarks from each of the senators. And after that, we will follow up with a conversation among ourselves. I'll get to ask a few questions. And then we'll open it up to the audience. And the audience, of course, is not just the people who are in this room, but the people who are worldwide on social media, Facebook. And for those people, if you have any questions, please send them in, and they will be taken and considered and put forward. So perhaps to begin, I might turn to you, Senator Warner, and let us have your view of what the Congress should be doing and what ought to be happening in U.S.-India relations.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ray. Thank you for many years of friendship. It's also great to see Jane, and I didn't realize that she's been promoted now as President Harmon. So you go from a congresswoman to a president in one fell swoop. So, and I know what great work you do here at the Wilson Center. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here. And you know, Dan is one of the newer senators. This is a great guy. This is somebody I think that has an enormously bright future in the Senate. There's a series of areas that we've been talking about working together on the issues regarding India is just the beginning of something that I think is going to grow into a much broader relationship. And we're going to, I know the bar's been set pretty low, but I think even during these times, we're going to surprise people on the amount of bipartisan stuff that can get done. First of all, is my role as co-chair of the U.S.-India Caucus, which is the largest bilateral caucus, which Dan is a member of. John Cornyn's the co-chair. I want to formally, to this audience and particular people who are watching, express our condolences about the Indian national who was shot down brutally in Kansas over the last period of time when someone yelled out, you know, kind of a horrific nationalistic comment and then proceeded to murder this individual. And it is absolutely appropriate the FBI investigate and pursue this crime as a hate crime, which is an example of what we have to stand against. And while I disagree with many of the policies of President Trump, let me also commend him for making similar comments in his State of the Union address the other night. That kind of activity is just not what our country's all about. In terms of India, I was last there. It's actually been about a year and a half. I went with President Obama when he visited with President Modi. We had a time to sit together. I've been with Prime Minister Modi a couple of times when he's been over. India is I think, in a pretty remarkable space at this point. We've seen India's economy actually, even after some of the challenges with the demonetization, which you talk about political courage. Could you imagine somehow saying we're going to get rid of the dollar bill or the $5 bill and the $10 bill or $5 bill and the $20 bill and not tell anybody? Now, the rollout of that might have been compared to the ACA rollout a little bit. It didn't come off as smoothly, but even with that, that effort to take on, part of the kind of dark economy in India, we've got India now with a GDP growth rate at 7.1%. That's basically about the highest in the world. And we've seen bilateral trade between the United States and India grow from roughly 15, 16 years ago, about $19 billion to now we're at, I think, about $110 billion. We've seen defense trade grow to $15 billion a year. And one of the areas that I've worked on is how we can increase the defense trade agreements. We've made some progress in that field. I think there's more to be done. I've been a particular advocate of trying to make sure that within the U.S. government we are willing to sell to the Indians things like drones, like the Guardian drone, which it would be a very important, I think, collateral. And since this drone is very compatible with lots of U.S. military, would add a whole new area of collaboration between our two countries in the defense space. I'm very interested in the fact that India has reopened some of the bidding on both the single-engine and dual-engine aircraft, and it's very interesting to see how far some of the American companies who are competing for those might be willing to go. Great opportunities there. I think, and I know we're going to get into a lot of questions on defense, so I'll save some of my other defense questions till later. Let me just make a couple last comments before I turn it over to Dan, and that is the importance beyond the defense relationship. I feel like what started under President Obama, and I hope will actually continue under President Trump in terms of a pivot towards Asia, will continue. I was one of the few remaining Democrats who still believe that TPP and trade policies made sense. I still believe that. I think there is much more that we can do for communities that have been left behind in trade. And I think in past administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, we've done a dreadful job on that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at enhanced trading opportunities. And my fear is that if we move away from a trade approach in Asia, that you'll see China dominate the region. And while India itself was not part of TPP, I think that notion of having an American and Indian-led collaboration in terms of trade policy and exchanges is the right strategic effort that we need to continue to move. And while I know the Trump administration is talking more about bilateral rather than multilateral trade agreements, I would hope that one of the areas that a lot of work has been done, but a first step that increase that trade between America and India would be a bit, and I think that those conversations have been taking place for some time. I hope to work with the Trump administration to continue to advance those. Final comment is just that we always say this, the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy, unique collaboration between our two countries. It really is a remarkable collaboration and connection. It's also one that has gone through a remarkable change in the last 25 plus years. We think back to the 90s when India was, in a sense, non-aligned, when most of its trade and collaboration was actually with the Soviet Union, and now we've moved from that status to, under Prime Minister Modi in particular, a much more open economy, a much closer collaboration with the United States. And while we talk about the two great democracies, the fact that we have a shared culture, that we have rule of law, and what we also have is, and this will be my last comment, is the wonderful power of the Indian American diaspora, which here in this country contributes in ways that cut across all realms. I think in the tech world where I came from, the number of Indian Americans who are great tech leaders across politics, arts, culture. This is a wonderful opportunity. And one of the things that I've wished that we would have explored is the number of Indian Americans who've gone back to India. There's 250,000 plus Indians back in India that carry American passports. How we could engage that community in a way that would be, in effect, bilateral ambassadors of people that have lived in both cultures really is an asset that we ought to try to take advantage of on a going forward basis. So some of my opening thoughts, but I'm glad to be here at the Wilson Center, glad to be with Ray, and look forward to this conversation with Dan. And, Milan, if I didn't hit all your top points in the opening comment, it's tough.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. We appreciate that. Senator Sullivan, you've had a long career not only in the past 2 years with the Senate, but as Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Matters, and we worked at the same time on the civil nuclear deal, and so we'd be very much interested in your perspectives on this relationship.
Well, thank you, Ray, and President Harmon. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and say a few words. It's great to be with my colleague, Mark Warner. So just to give you a sense, there's a lot of bipartisanship going on in Washington. I was Mark Warner's secret Santa. I was. He got this great smoked salmon from Alaska. I'm sure I probably gave it away. My wife, this is my wife's family's fish camp up on the Yukon River. So now he's my neighbor. So he just moved into the office next to mine in the Hart Building, and we're literally talking about getting over there with office warming gift. It'll be more salmon, and so that's some of the bipartisanship you see going on. I will mention I'm from Alaska. And, when we talk about America being an Asia-Pacific or Indo-Asia-Pacific nation, my state, of course, epitomizes this. I had the opportunity to meet recently with Prime Minister Abe when he was in town. We did a little breakfast, a couple senators met with him. And I started by saying, Mr. Prime Minister, we're not just good allies, but from Alaska's perspective, we're neighbors. As a matter of fact, my hometown of Anchorage is closer to Tokyo than it is to Washington, D.C. So we are very Asia-Pacific, at least where I'm from, and I think that's Indo-Asia-Pacific, and I think that's important. As Ray mentioned, I served in the Bush administration. In the second term under Secretary Rice, Condoleezza Rice, I was one of her assistant secretaries of state in charge of economic, energy, finance, trade, kind of a broad portfolio of issues. And at the time, I think a lot of people remember it was viewed as a very important time during U.S.-India relations, particularly with the civil nuclear deal that was led by Undersecretary Nicholas Burns. And one of the things, we were all pushing for that, all of us. That was really important, got it through the Senate. But was also, at the time, I was the governing board member for the United States for the International Energy Agency. This is the IEA, based in Paris. For those of you who are familiar with it, it's the international organization was set up by Henry Kissinger in the United States after the first Gulf oil embargo. That the United States thought, hey, we need to have our own group. There's OPEC. What's the counter to OPEC? The counter is a group of consuming industrialized nations, which was all OECD countries. Well, in the Bush administration, we thought it made a lot of sense to broaden that beyond the OECD to the other big consuming energy countries in the world, namely India and China. So I went over to India and China more than a few times to press for, hey, you guys need to be members in this IEA because you're a big energy consumer, and we need to work together. And it was very interesting. In India and in China, the reaction was a little bit, depending on the ministry that I went to. But there was kind of, some were kind of enthusiastic, but there was a little bit of a, hey, why would we join this rich OECD rich man's club? So some skepticism. But I think we're continuing to work on it. But I think I mention that because I think there's a whole host of areas where we can deepen our cooperation. And we're obviously going to talk about the military, where I think our Department of Defense, by designating India as a major defense partner, was an important element of that. And I think more broadly from a U.S. perspective, it makes sense that we recognize something that's very critical to our national security. That is, we are an ally-rich nation, and most of our adversaries or potential adversaries are ally-poor. I won't name them, but you know who I'm talking about because there are not many countries that want to continually join alliances or partnerships with certain countries in the world, but with the United States, to me, it's an enormous strategic advantage. So we've been pressing, I think, in a bipartisan way, the Trump administration to recognize that, and I certainly think General Mattis and Rex Tillerson and H.R. McMaster, who I happened to serve under when I was a Marine, They all recognize that, and I think that's real positive. So, from my perspective, what would be the way ahead to think about the U.S.-India relationship? First, continue to focus on some of the non-military issues. Energy. I think we have enormous opportunities to deepen our cooperation in energy, including India joining the IEA. I still think that's a very good idea that should get bipartisan support. I actually mentioned it to the Prime Minister when he was in town last time at the dinner that we had for him. And I think there's interest in India, certainly. And there should be interest on our side. And it's something that I'll continue to press the Trump administration. I pressed the Obama administration previously on that. I think it makes sense for both countries. In terms of defense and military cooperation, we need to look at areas where we can align our interests and continue deepening that relationship. I'll give you one example that, again, relates to Alaska. We have a huge military exercise called Red Flag Alaska up in our training facility called J-Park. It's the biggest airspace for training, certainly in the United States, almost anywhere in the world. And we had Indian fighter jets up there. A lot of people didn't know that. This past summer, training air-to-air kind of exercises with not only United States military forces, but other forces in Alaska. And that's the kind of training that we need to continue. Third, there's been a lot of talk, President Harmon mentioned Munich. I was actually part of that delegation with Senator McCain, and I was asked to speak on a panel on the Asia Pacific with the defense minister of Singapore, the prime minister or the foreign minister of Korea. It was moderated by the former Prime Minister of Australia and a senior Chinese official, and naturally talk of the South China Sea and freedom of navigation operations were prominent on this panel. My view is the view that the Obama administration and now the Trump administration continue to espouse, which is the United States should fly, sail, and operate anywhere international law allows us, including the South China Sea, especially the South China Sea, given how important that is to international commerce, given that how we've been doing that, keeping the sea lanes of navigation open for decades, and given how those operations by the United States have benefited everybody in the region, probably China more than anyone, in terms of keeping sea lanes for world commerce open. But we need to continue to do that with our allies, And I would suggest, and it might be something that we could talk about, that one growing ally that might be interested in doing those kind of FON-ops, as we call them, with the United States would be India, because they certainly have an interest in keeping the lanes of commerce and sea lanes open. And a fourth and final area on the military side that I think might be worth exploring is American military operations and interest in Afghanistan, where India, I think, could play and has expressed perhaps a more engaged role helping us and the Afghans. As a matter of fact, a number of the senators met with the president of Afghanistan in Munich on some of these issues a couple weeks ago. So that's another area where I see there's potential for cooperation. But I'm like Mark. I think that the upside and the potential and the opportunities, whether it's on the econ side, trade side, energy side, or increasing our alliance and operations with regard to potential military cooperation, is all on an upward trajectory. And I think that's certainly good for the United States, and I would also think that it would be good for India. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I think that those opening remarks show how broad this relationship should be. We have advertised this, however, as focusing on defense cooperation. So I'd like just to drill down for a few minutes on that, if we could. Both of you serve on the armed services and have been active on armed services matters, and particularly in regard to the legislation which was put through last year as a part of the National Defense Authorization Act. Section 1294 talks in terms of a major defense partner, talks about issues to be resolved, and I'm wondering if you might give us your views on what major defense partner really means in practice, how issues might be resolved, and whether there are prospects for follow-up legislation to put some meat on the bones of the concept of a major defense partner. Go ahead.
Which one do you want?
Go ahead.
Well, that was something that Dan and I and John Corn and others, we all worked on to try to get that into NDAA. And, you know, Ray, you asked us this first question. It is a new term of art, major defense partner. I think it is a designation that has room to be expanded upon. I would like us to actually move into the category of kind of those countries that fall into that kind of more defined category of non-NATO type allies, which has a more of a definition to it. But I think major defense partner is a great step in the right direction. I think the challenges, I've been frustrated with our State Department, Defense Department, in terms of for example, the sale of the Guardians, the UAVs, which is, I think, unmanned systems across the board, land-based, maritime-based, air-based, are going to be the next big thing, and what a great area of collaboration. I think we've got some challenges and opportunities on F-16 and F-18s in terms of potential sale as India rethinks the purchase of those jets. I think we've got real opportunity to collaborate with India as they produce their own domestic aircraft carrier. There's been a great deal of interest from India on some of our systems that we're using on our new carriers, some of them which have had some, we're going to get rid of all the glitches, and then we'll be able to maybe collaborate with India. I think one of the challenges, and I'll close on this, though, is the 30% defense offset requirement. I think there are certain systems that India does not have the full capacity at this point to absorb that full 30%. And I've argued for a number of times that there would, we could work towards that, but isn't there a way in the interim that if we were selling equipment and we could only hit 20%, for example, that we could use that other 10% where we might be able to help India with infrastructure, or as Dan mentioned, with energy, or with training. Here's a country that requires almost 1 million new jobs, a month, every 2 months. We've got enormous capability in certain other areas that would be in India's national interest. We've not reached that level of agreement yet, but those are areas that if we could deal with that 30% offset issue, I think we'd open up a lot more collaboration and cooperation, and might be able to put a little more meat on the bones of this characterization that we came up with of major defense partner.
Senator Sullivan?
Yeah, so it's actually as Mark mentioned, it's actually a status under the NDA that's actually unique to India. So the idea is to start to institutionalize defense training, defense cooperation, potential tech transfers, and one of the elements that we had in the amendment that a number of us worked hard on was in addition to that designation, which is kind of process-oriented, is there was another amendment that we worked on in the NDAA that talked about how the United States should seek to work more closely and have exchanges with Indian military officers, including general and flag officers, which I think is also important. So to me, Ray, in terms of, I think we have an opportunity to build on those recent NDAA provisions, which, recently became law, and to try to start to implement them, to try to start execute them, or to execute what the purpose was. So I think we've made progress highlighting in this last year's NDAA the potential and the importance of the U.S.-India military relationship with these provisions. And from my perspective, what we should do is start to look at, fulfilling the promise of these amendments.
Do you think that there is an opportunity for further legislation to further that in this 115th Congress?
Yeah, I do. I'm a big believer in, though, not always trying to pile up with regard to additional provisions. Let's see and let's focus our efforts on, and we can do this as senators, on actually looking at the language, which is now the law, and carrying it out. For example, the exchanges with regard to our military officers and senior level Indian officers. I think that's actually a really big deal. And now it's in the law that we need to focus on doing that. And I think, I was talking about the kind of training operations, but to have that senior level exchange, as you know, we've done that with certain countries for years, for decades, and building that mill-to-mill relationship among our senior leadership and the senior leadership of the Indian military, that is a way to make progress that can last, in my view, for decades.
And I would just agree. I mean, it's that personal relationships oftentimes where we can do some of that training at American facilities as well as Indian facilities, gives that kind of long-term relationship building that becomes critically important. It might be that lieutenant that ends up being the general later, but they have built a relationship with the American military that pays enormous benefits that you just can't predict. But I think it's a great suggestion.
Just one more question before we open it up to the audience, both here and on social media. Secretary Jaishankar is in town, as you know, and one of the featured areas in which he is said to be holding discussions has to do with the fight against international terrorism. And in that regard, both the United States and India have become more and more concerned about terrorism, particularly emanating from Pakistan. Do you foresee, or what kind of cooperation do you foresee in this very important area?
Let me start on that. I mean, we have a very strong relationship in terms of intel community to intel community. It can strengthen more. But when I was last in Delhi, met with our colleagues in the Indian intel community, and there is obviously enormous concern about not only in Kashmir, but in terms of sanctioning terrorist organizations out of Pakistan. And I think India has shown remarkable restraint, not only after the awful massacres in Mumbai, but continued efforts. It feels to me kind of India has risen to the place where it sees itself as a major international power. And my concern, and I want us to maintain strong relationships with Pakistan, but Pakistan still feels like it is caught in this battle with India, that everything is seen through the lens of that long-term conflict. And I actually think it would be in Pakistan's best interest to, broaden its outreach and look, so it doesn't view everything through this analysis. And that was one of the reasons that led me to actually vote against some of the foreign aid requests last year to Pakistan, because I wanted to send a strong message that, and again, particularly on the intel side, that the Pakistanis can't play it both ways. You can't on one hand say we're allies and we're going to collaborate against certain terrorist groups a la Taliban, but then turn a blind eye to other parts of the Taliban forces or other forces that may be crossing into India and wreaking havoc. This is a long-term important relationship, but I am very concerned in terms of the long-term stability as Pakistan seems to come under more and more domestic assault from terrorist organizations, economic challenges. We've got to find ways to both push and prod Pakistan to continue to stand up to its potential. But obviously, one of the areas of collaboration, we have both India and the United States have obviously been victims of the kind of terrorist activities that we have to stand united to fight against.
Senator Sullivan, the fight on terrorism?
Well, I think there's obvious areas of common interest between the United States and India on this very important topic, as Mark just mentioned. And, you know, I don't think that either India or Pakistan has to view their relationship with in kind of a zero-sum game terms. We can, from the U.S. perspective, I believe, we can have strong relations with both countries. As a matter of fact, having strong relations with both countries is very important, particularly in the cooperation on international terrorism. There's concerns. We had a recent armed services hearing where one of our senior generals in Afghanistan expressed concerns about safe havens in Pakistan for terrorism and support for insurgent groups. I know that the Indians have similar concerns. So that is an area where the cooperation between the United States and India, I think, is very natural. Our interests are very aligned there. But again, my view is we need to keep working together, all three countries, on this issue because it's an issue that also obviously impacts Pakistan as well. So to me, the focus on trilateral cooperation in this area is very important. But the U.S. and India share significant common interests in combating international terrorism.
Can I add just one other comment there?
Absolutely.
And I think this is an area, I agree with Dan, but it's one of the areas that I'm not sure it would be appropriate for the United States to broker this. But, you know, the Indians, I recall a while back, were going to train 1,000 civil servants from Afghanistan that would start putting in place the kind of civil society structure that we all would like to see in Afghanistan, and frankly, an area where we and the other nations who've been involved have not done a very good job. But because Pakistan views Indian involvement in Afghanistan as kind of in their neighborhood, they look with such great suspicion at anything that India might do vis-a-vis Afghanistan. So, boy, oh boy, if somehow, you know, we could de-escalate the potential conflict between India and Pakistan, it would be great not only in terms of our kind of united fight against terrorist operations, but boy, oh boy, it would be a great step forward as well in terms of long-term stability for Afghanistan.
Understood. Now let's open it up. We have a hard stop exactly at 5 o'clock. These senators are very, very busy. So I ask you to keep your questions in the form of questions and not comments, and make them short and sweet. Yes, sir. Ben Schwartz, right here. Yeah, would you identify yourself, Ben, and tell you who you're with?
My name is Ben Schwartz. I run the defense and aerospace.
Here comes a mic here. Let's get that. And be sure to put it close to your mouth, Ben, or else it won't work.
All right. Ben Schwartz, I run the Defense and Aerospace Program at the U.S.-India Business Council. Ray, I want to thank you for putting this on, and I want to commend the two senators for the work you've done to promote the U.S.-India defense relationship. I want to highlight a point that you alluded to, Senator Warner, about the overlapping jurisdictional challenges that exist for promoting defense trade. One of the things that that was included in the NDAA was an encouragement to appoint an official whose explicit responsibility was to basically push the interagency to get approval for various things, because you got energy, state, DOD, commerce, and you really need to get them all walking in the same direction to do a lot of the things. Given all the other priorities of this administration, I really do think it's going to take some outside emphasis to get them to fulfill that mandate in the NDAA. Will you and others maybe continue to encourage them to fill that position?
Yes, short answer. And I'm having a senior moment. Our last defense secretary, Ash Carter, when he was a deputy, actually was, I believe, the kind of go-to guy to help move move some of this process along. And I think someone that carries clout with all of these various different agencies is really important. And yeah, you got my commitment that I'll see if we can try to do that. And this ought to be absolutely bipartisan.
And just to add on point to that, that process can be cumbersome even with the closest of U.S. allies. And so it's not just related to India, but we see that with other countries who, we've had decades-long relationship and deep alliances with, where things still take quite a long time to get through the process for many of the reasons that you mentioned, because there's just a lot of agencies involved.
Thank you. Bob Hathaway? Want to give Bob a mic here?
Bob Hathaway here at the center. Senator Warner's very last comment in response to Ray's last question just begs for further exploration. You suggested that it might be very appropriate and helpful for the United States to move toward helping India and Pakistan reduce some of the tensions that have marred that relationship. Most people believe that that effort would have to start in and with Kashmir. President Trump, or I guess President-elect Trump, in a phone conversation with a Pakistani prime minister, intimated that he might be prepared to do that. The Indians have consistently maintained over the decades that would be a deal breaker in terms of any strengthening of the U.S.-India relationship. Do either of you have any insights as to what the views of the current new administration here in town might be? Do you think this is time for the United States to take a more active role in that issue?
You know, Bob, since you asked for a comment about what the new administration strategic sense here is, I'm going to turn it over to my great Republican colleague, Dan Sullivan, who I'm sure is on a lot quicker speed dial with the administration than I am.
Well, thanks for that, Mark.
Yeah, thanks.
Look, I think that it's important to recognize, and this goes on in this isn't just President-elect and then now President Trump. I think this, if you look at kind of the history of presidential campaigns and then incoming administrations, how there can be changes in views. And also it matters as you're getting your cabinet officials set up and your deputy secretaries and undersecretaries and people who are the political appointees who are running the agencies. I'm smiling here because I'm about to take a little swipe at my colleague here about trying to move forward on all those cabinet nominees, but I won't do that.
I've got, to the chagrin of a lot of folks, I voted for more than most.
Okay, that's good. And we are starting to move forward now, finally. But that's important. I don't know the answer to that question, but let me just give you in kind of a somewhat analogous situation, which was as the transition was occurring with regard to another important, long-standing, I think 8 consistent administrations with regard to our one China policy. And there were some questions that arose during the transition by some of the things that the president-elect had said. And then once the team came into place and people who were focused on these issues, you saw a reaffirmation of that important policy. You saw a defense secretary that was out engaging with our allies in the region. You saw an important phone call between President Trump and Xi Jinping. So I would imagine as the importance, and it is important, of the U.S.-India, U.S.-Pakistan relationships and the important dynamics, but also the kind of longer-term consistent strategic view that we've had and they've had on certain sensitive issues comes more to the fore, that you might have a similar outcome in terms of what's happening on those kind of issues that you've had on other Asia-Pacific issues. And I just offered that one, which was a big one, on the one China policy that occurred, just a couple weeks ago.
Thank you. The lady here in the back. Yes, ma'am. Right there. The lady who had her hand up. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I
Would
could
it
only
be politically incorrect to say, does that lady have a beard?
Yes, a
I could
beard and
only
a
see
suit.
the top of his head. There you go. Sorry.
No, that's fine. It happened to me a long time ago, but I'll get a haircut, I promise. So I'm Jonathan Ward. I do China-India relations at University of Oxford, and Senator Sullivan, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned the idea of freedom of navigation operations with India in the South China Sea. One of the concerns that I imagine would arise with the Indian government, of course, is that China would then use a sort of similar rhetoric of freedom of navigation operations to send their own vessels into particularly the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, certainly the Bay of Bengal. And I'm just wondering how you might, if you were designing kind of like bilateral or trilateral phone ops, including India, how might you address those sorts of concerns should they arise with the Indian government?
Well, I've been saying, and again, I think this is a pretty strong bipartisan view, that, and it was the view that the Obama administration, certainly Secretary Carter, held, our senior defense officials. I just actually met with Admiral Harris yesterday, who was in town. He's our PACOM commander. That continuing to do fawn ops is very important in the South China Sea, but all over. We do these all over the world, and these benefit pretty much everybody. And what we have encouraged previously the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, and our military to do is do them on a regular basis, so they don't become some kind of big deal, right? We're just doing them like we always do them. When I had this Munich security conference panel 2 weeks ago, the senior Chinese official kind of made the case that, well, America's creating rising tensions in the South China Sea. And I said, that's not the case. The country that's actually changing the facts on the ground now by militarizing these islands, which they clearly are, even though their leadership said they're not, and they are, is China. The United States is doing what we've been doing for decades, running fawn ops in that part of the world, because I think almost 1/5 or even more of world trade goes through that area. So we're not doing anything differently. The people that are creating the different facts on the ground, and in my view, the tension in the region, are China. The difference that I've been encouraging is that this shouldn't be just an American operation. We have allies that benefit tremendously from the freedom of navigation that we've pretty much, and our Navy is pretty much provided since the end of World War II. And so if it can be any of our allies, it could be the French or the British or the Japanese or the Koreans or the Australians or the Indians. So my suggestion has been we need to continue to do them regularly, but we need to have our allies who benefit from this to do it with us. So with regard to India, well, that might be a stretch right now in terms of what they see as their strategic interest and the importance in deploying their Navy. But could we do a fawn op more closer to home from them, just to demonstrate that they recognize the importance of freedom of navigation in terms of keeping the sea lanes of international commerce open and showing their kind of common interest with us on those kind of things? As you mentioned, perhaps closer to their own country? Sure, that might be another way to look at it. But my view, and again, I think it's very much a bipartisan view, is that we need to continue to do that, certainly. We are going to continue to do that. We need to do it on a regular basis. And if we could have allies in countries that have common interests with us, which pretty much everybody does, to do it with us, it is a strong, strong signal to the countries, in this case China, that have militarized one of the most important areas of international commerce in the world without any, by the way, legal justification. As you know, the Hague Tribunal came down and essentially said that a lot of what they were doing in terms of the building of these reefs and militarized island had no support from an international law perspective.
And the only thing I would add is that I agree completely with Dan. This cannot be simply viewed as a rising tension vis-a-vis America and China. Since so much of the world's product goes through these shipping lanes, we need to see other nations, exercise their rights of navigation as well, do it on a regular basis. Obviously, you think about the other nations in region that even have their own territorial claims. One of the challenges and one of the concerns I have, and this is a bit of aside from the point though, is that we have to maintain strong strategic relations with all countries in region, and it concerns me at times when I see a rather erratic president in the Philippines who, recognizing that the Philippines has claim on some of this territory as well, but be great if we can keep that kind of united front that Dan has talked about, and that would include not just Japan and Korea, but Vietnam and Indonesia and Thailand and other countries, Malaysia, others in region.
Go ahead. Would you identify yourself, sir? Okay.
Which one wants to take first? Well, I think there will always be exchanges of information. The minister had been in China. There may be some ability to convey messages, and I think that's important. And I don't, but I think it long term, and one of the reasons why I felt something like, I don't know, this is politically unpopular to say at this point, that arrangements like TPP were important, is there's going to be an economic order that TPP had 40% of the world's population. If you would have included an India in that, you're talking more like close to 50 to 60%. And I do have concerns that I'd like this to be more of a market-based, transparent, rule of law set of economic rules for that region. And my concern on a going forward basis, if the administration tries to simply do this all on a variety of bilateral relations, I'm afraid that China, and we've seen with the Asian Investment Bank they've set up and other institutions, they may step into the void. So this is both on, we're talking a lot about military, but we're also here about what kind of economic rules are going to be for where the future of a lot of American products and a lot of American innovation should be sold into.
And I think it's very natural, obviously, for the Foreign Secretary of India to be visiting China, look at the long border and their neighbors. I think we should be undertaking as much engagement with China as possible. If you look at kind of our history in terms of big power strategy, the U.S. had a strategy for decades of trying to contain the Soviet Union. We've never really had a policy of trying to contain China. It's always been focused in many ways on I mean, at least since the early 70s on engagement. So, but longer term, as it comes down to so many relationships between countries, I think, the longer term trajectory really relates to shared values, which I think in that case, India and the United States have increasing shared values, whether it's the fact that we're both democracies, whether it's our trade relationship, and the shared values of making sure that not one country in the Indo-Pacific region tries to militarize certain key transportation routes. I don't think the Indians see that in their interest at all. So to me, those kind of longer term trends bode well for a deeper relationship across sectors, military, economic, energy. And it was interesting, I know it was probably about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, there was a big Economist piece on U.S.-India relations, and it talked about President Obama's pivot to the Asia-Pacific, but then it talked about Prime Minister Modi's pivot to Washington. So to me, that is a trajectory that I see as positive for both countries, but also continuing because of our long-term shared values and shared interests.
Well, we've come just about to the end, so we got time for one more question. And yes, sir, Mr. Ambassador.
Just briefly, and I'm mindful of the time. Yes, I will. I'm Bob Dickey. I have a consulting firm in the finance arena in Boston, and delighted to be here at the Wilson Center again. Just to follow up on that, what is the prevailing perception in India now of China? I know it's a long history, you alluded to that, but to what extent do they see themselves with skin in the game vis-a-vis the waterways and the South China Sea and related matters, economic and other vis-a-vis China, and to what extent you might just comment briefly, given the time, on their military posture in that potential connection.
Well, I to be honest, and I know you don't hear politicians say this very frequently, but I don't know the answer to that. I would leave that to someone who is a much better expert on India-China relations. I can tell you kind of from my perspective as someone who's very focused on U.S. policy, it's kind of the way I just articulated the views that I think there's converging long-term interests because of shared values and strategic interest in the region between the United States and India. I don't know exactly what
I would add that, and this is again more based on conversation with Indian parliamentarians and Indian business leaders. They see China as obviously an emerging power, whether it is in some places a competitor, in some places a collaborator. You've got two countries north of 1 billion people that are next to each other, and you've got obviously with Tibet, China sees that there's kind of their extra protection. But I think you raise a good question because if we don't get this right, as China thinks about different trade routes, as China's got this notion of building military, well, don't recall what they were exactly calling, but a series of ports, including one, for example, in Pakistan at this point. I think it's going to be not unlike the U.S.-China relationship. We have to engage, and in some places we're going to be competitive, and hopefully there will be more places we can be collaborative.
Well, we've come to the end of our program, sadly. There's so much more that could be said, but I want to say how much I think that the example that's been set here this afternoon by Senator Warner and Senator Sullivan is exactly how Washington ought to work in a bipartisan manner in a very positive way. So let's give them a big hand for what they have said. Thank you very much.